Well, of course, Patrick Brown has been keeping a very close eye on any news on trade talks. Yesterday, he was here in Ottawa to meet with government ministers. That includes the Industry Minister Melanie Joly. And with more, we're now joined by Patrick Brown, the Mayor of Brampton, Ontario. Mayor Brown, thank you for taking the time again. And sorry we didn't see each other yesterday.
Well, great to talk to you again.
And you. So listen, you did meet with Minister Joly for the first time yesterday since Donald Trump, made that additional 10% tariff threat and broke off trade talks with Canada. Are you worried about things getting even worse for workers, for people in your community right now?
I think it's likely going to get worse for the auto sector in Canada. We had, obviously meetings with Dominic LeBlanc, Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, Evan Solomon, who runs FedDev Ontario, and Melanie Joly, the Industry Minister, about how we can help workers in Brampton and, how we navigate these very choppy waters. And based on what Stellantis is saying is that there's no business case for auto jobs in Canada as long as tariffs are in place. I think the immediate outlook looks pretty negative, and it's why we're really looking at efforts of how we can create jobs in other spaces as we handle this disruption and chaos from the U.S.
So looking for alternatives at this point, but in the meantime, we have the federal government threatening to take legal action against Stellantis for moving production of the Jeep Compass from your city to a facility in Illinois. You're on record saying you're grateful that Minister Joly is doing this. What outcome do you hope the legal action actually produces?
Well, we actually asked for the legal action, and so more than being supportive, we want this legal recourse to be robust. Stellantis and the precursor company received land given to them in 1985. There was the 2009 Stephen Harper, Dalton McGuinty bailout of Chrysler that has not been paid back. The 2022 retooling funds from Premier Ford and Prime Minister Trudeau, and the production incentives. So this has been a company that has depended on taxpayer generosity, and they've signed contracts. And so they can't cut and run. If we allow them to cut and run, every other auto company that is being bullied by Donald Trump's administration will look at this and say there's no consequence to leave. And so I think this is really a litmus test on Canada's willingness to defend jobs in this space. And so I think it's more important than just Stellantis, than just the Brampton plant. I think this has national ramifications if we roll over. And so speaking with Melanie Joly yesterday, my input was blunt. We need to make this as difficult as possible. We need to use every tool at our disposal to make sure that the agreements that they have signed and the benefits they have received are honored.
So what does that look like? Maintaining, and I know, because I believe the letter of the agreement says it would maintain the footprint that was in Brampton going forward. Is that what you're looking for? Are you looking for financial compensation and payback for the investments? What exactly do you hope this produces?
Our first goal would be Stellantis would say, okay, we're not going to be bullied. We're going to accept that we've signed legal contracts that promise production at this plant. And so in terms of the product, I am neutral to that, but I want work there. I want a vehicle that is assigned there for the 3,000 experienced, trained Unifor Local 1285 auto workers who are ready to roll up their sleeves and get back to work. And so that's the first wish, that a product is returned. If they don't return a product, then there has to be compensation for Canadian taxpayers. You can't accept, a handout and then run from the obligations that came with that handout. It's all tied to production. It's tied to production in Canada. This company would have been in financial chaos if it wasn't for the 2009 bailout, and their future looked grim in 2022 when the Canadian government and the Ontario government came to the rescue. So there is a legal obligation they have.
A legal obligation, but we have seen some reaction to it, though. Of course, we saw that anti-tariff ad that was put up by the Ontario government a couple of weeks ago. We've also seen the quota put out by the federal government, essentially saying that assembled cars from the United States, only a certain amount will be brought into Canada. After that, everything else would be tariffed. Are you concerned that actually will inspire U.S. car makers to pull out of Canada altogether, since we already saw Donald Trump calling off trade talks over those two issues?
I want U.S. automakers to know how significant and how high the stakes are. if they think they can just cut and run from Canada and leave a very minimal presence, there is consequences to that betrayal of Canadian taxpayers. And what I mean by that is largely Canada is filled with North American built cars. The U.S. automakers enjoy a massive market share in Canada. We are the largest export market for American vehicles. And that could change. I'm sure there are car companies right now smiling with glee at the chaos that Donald Trump has created, whether it's Japan, South Korea, or China. There'd be other automakers interested in setting up production in Canada if American cars could not be sold here. It would change the market. And so if Donald Trump really wants to put up a trade wall with Canada, it would devastate his own production because we are his largest export market. That's why I think a lot of us are scratching our heads. And does he really know the consequences of this divorce that he seems to be pushing?
I'm thinking back to when GM threatened to shut down the Oshawa plant, and what we saw there was the union fight back, essentially spread a message to Canadians: do not buy GM because they betray Canadians. Do you think this is an effort that you're willing to pick up from your community for this country in regards to Stellantis?
Well, I certainly don't think anyone should be buying Stellantis product if they cut and run. If they're going to have this betrayal of Canadian taxpayers and legal agreements that they have signed, then yes, we should opt out of Stellantis. And so, we're not there yet, but I think we're pretty close to seeing a campaign like that emerge. We're hoping that sanity will prevail at Stellantis and they won't be bullied and intimidated by this U.S. administration, and they'll honor the legal agreements they've signed. But I think we're at the point where it could get a lot uglier for them in terms of how Canadians are going to react to their product. And I would not be surprised to see a campaign like that emerge in the near future.
Now, I mentioned briefly the anti-tariff ad that was run by the Ontario government in U.S. markets that has now been suspended. Ontario Premier Doug Ford hoping that by suspending the ad, it gets trade talks back on track vis-a-vis Canada and the United States. But do you support that kind of anti-tariff campaign? Do you support that kind of ad? Because the Ontario Premier has been criticized by other premiers for moving forward with that.
Well, I support the campaign speaking truth in the political debate of the United States. A lot of people are silenced by the Trump administration or scared to speak up. I've spoken to a lot of elected officials in the U.S. who, the temperature there is challenging. They don't want to go against the U.S. president, even though the history of the Republican Party has been that of free trade. Ronald Reagan viewed tariffs as taxes. He viewed it as a cancer on American prosperity. And so these are all Ronald Reagan's words. He might have chosen the parts of the speech to share, but these are Ronald Reagan's words, his ideas, and his general philosophy. And I thought it was powerful. I think it's made a splash. And the status quo wasn't working. We had no deal. We had to shake things up. And I think Premier Ford has certainly shaken up the conversation. And hopefully, Donald Trump understands now that Canadians don't take this theft of our jobs and our economy, lying down.
Mayor Patrick Brown, always appreciate the time. We'll speak again soon. Thank you for this.
Thank you.